Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to AESP Converging COVID-19, Environment, Health, and Equity. The name is Maya Trotz, and I am the co-chair of this conference, and would really like to welcome you to our fifth session, which looks at designing a future without pollution and waste. Some logistics. We are recording this webinar, and so with this announcement, you are being recorded. Some directions for today. The best way to look at the webinar is to do side-by-side view on your screen. And so this is something that you control on your computer. For some of you, this is a drop-down menu that you would use to click that. We do have sign language interpretation, and so that's best seen in side-by-side mode. We also have closed captioning, which you can adjust at the bottom of your Zoom panel. We want you to ask questions for our panelists, and so we encourage you to send them through the Q&A. If you're watching on YouTube Live, you can also post questions there or tweet us with the hashtag AESP Converging COVID-19. Now I'd like to play a short video welcoming you to our conference.
The Association of Environmental Engineering and Science Professors, AEESP, is made up of professors in academic programs throughout the world who provide education in the sciences and technologies of environmental protection.
As hard as we work in our domain expertise, we need to work equally as hard to build positive human relationships with our colleagues, our students, and the communities that we serve.
We will continue to work towards a more just, equitable, and healthy society.
The goal of the virtual conference, Converging COVID-19, Environment, Health, and Equity, is to bring together different disciplines of environmental engineering and science to discuss actions to form a more healthy, just, and equitable society.
The conference themes align with the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine's grand challenges for environmental engineering in the 21st century. And they are
COVID-19, systemic biases, and environmental engineering and education.
COVID-19, fostering informed decisions and actions.
COVID-19 and the creation of efficient, healthy, and resilient cities.
COVID-19 and sustainably supplying food, water, and energy.
COVID-19 and designing a future without pollution and waste.
COVID-19 and climate change mitigation and adaptation.
Each session, as much as possible, will look at the convergence of air,
water,
wastewater,
food,
people, the built environment,
waste, fostered by the COVID-19 pandemic, and the unfolding realities of the need to address inequities in our communities.
Faculty from the University of South Florida and the University of California, Merced, are pleased to hold this virtual conference with support from AESP and the National Science Foundation's CBET program.
I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Colleen Naughton. Dr. Naughton is also the conference co-chairperson and co-PI. She is an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering at the University of California, Merced, and she serves on the AESP Government Affairs Committee. She's a former Science and Technology Policy Fellow through the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Naughton's research focuses on designing sustainable and culturally sensitive food, energy, water systems, and she is really the brainchild behind this conference. So I will ask Dr. Naughton to take it over from here.
Thank you, Dr. Trotz, for that kind introduction. I would say you're the brainchild of this conference, but thank you for the thoughts. So welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending when you're watching this. I'd first like to pause to acknowledge all local Indigenous peoples, including the Yokuts and Miwok, who inhabited the land of University of California, Merced. We embrace their continued connection to this region and thank them for allowing us to live, work, learn, and collaborate on their traditional homeland. Next, I would like to dedicate this session to my grandmother, or Nana. Her name was Marian Jurowski, and she passed away this Tuesday. She would have appreciated this session on designing a future without pollution or waste. She was one of the first to teach me about the environment. I remember how she would clean all of her recyclables and neatly bind the papers and separate paper, plastic, and metal before we had single stream recycling. She was also a young girl growing up after the Great Depression, and she really did not like to waste anything, food or material. She did not live to see a future without pollution or waste, but hopefully her grandchild, myself, and those after me will live to see a future without pollution or waste. According to the World Bank, the world generates 2 billion tons of municipal solid waste annually, 1/3 of which are not properly managed or managed safely. Every year, an estimated 1/3 of food is produced is wasted, equivalent to 1.3 billion tons by consumers, retailers, and from inefficient transportation and harvesting practices. In 2015, 1 in every 6 deaths was attributed to a disease from exposure to pollution. Air pollution in particular causes 7 million premature deaths worldwide. And there's 300 million tons of plastic waste produced every year, according to the United Nations Environment Program. COVID-19 has caused further challenges for pollution and waste. The food supply chain was disrupted and tons of crops were overturned. Millions of gallons of milk were dumped and millions of hogs were euthanized prematurely. We've seen an explosion of personal protective equipment, litter, and waste. Gloves and masks that are made of petroleum products that are already turning up in our oceans, streams, and rivers. Though initial lockdowns decreased some air pollutants, it did not reduce all, and studies show that exposure to air pollution can make people more susceptible to COVID-19 and more serious illness. Despite these sobering statistics, there are solutions. Today we have an amazing panel lined up to touch in many different aspects of the grand challenges to design a future without pollution or waste, from different approaches to solid waste management during COVID-19, working with communities and innovating food and wastewater, air pollution during COVID-19, particularly for underserved communities, transportation and decarbonizing during the uncertainty of COVID-19, and a future with green chemistry. So I'd like to first introduce our first speaker, Dr. Sunny Ivey. Dr. Ivey is an assistant professor of chemical and environmental engineering at the University of California, Riverside. Her research centers on developing and applying advanced air quality monitoring and data fusion approaches to characterize air pollution in the United States. These advanced approaches are used to answer questions related to community scale exposure and source characterization. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ivey.
Good morning. I'm Dr. Sunny Ivey, again, a third-year professor of chemical and environmental engineering at UC Riverside. Today, I'm going to briefly discuss the activity and emissions trends of the COVID-19 shutdown, followed by a discussion of the implications of these activity changes for air pollution, future mitigation, and how these factors are disproportionately impacting environmental justice communities. Next, please. So it's well known by now that the COVID-19 shutdown led to substantial changes in human activity, such as the reduction in vehicle miles traveled, air travel, industrial production, and building energy consumption. More locally in Southern California, peak reductions in vehicle miles traveled occurred in mid-April and gradually began to rebound. Presently, traffic flow has not returned to pre-COVID levels in the South Coast Air Basin. And we also saw that traffic reductions were not spatially uniform, where coastal counties saw greater reductions than the inland counties. Potentially, this is due to a higher fraction of essential workers in the inland counties. Next slide, please. So the Los Angeles Basin has a unique combination of meteorology, atmospheric chemistry, and topography that makes our region susceptible to higher levels of air pollution. While primary air pollution, such as tailpipe emissions, have more local impacts, secondary pollution, such as ozone and secondary PM, can be more spatially homogeneous within several thousand meters. Our South Coast Air Quality Management District carries out regular studies of cancer risk in the basin, formerly known as the MATES studies. And what they found is that the risk per million for cancer actually strongly coincides with highways and intermodal transport facilities, such as rail yards and shipping ports. So in recent years, the state of California actually mandated that we increase the resources that should be invested to address community exposure disparities, which are most often seen or most often observed in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities in Southern California. So in both figures on the right, I've actually highlighted the 3 phase 1 environmental justice communities. And of particular interest is the Wilmington, West Long Beach, Carson community. The graphic on the left is credited to Martha Dina Agulo and presents a very sobering image of the disparities in COVID-19 cases near this community. The cases per 100,000 people are indicated by the dark dots, and the census tracts are colored by the Cal and Virus Green score. And the red colors indicate the tracts that have more vulnerable communities. And so we can clearly see that the COVID cases are highest in the most vulnerable census tracts. However, this figure actually inspires this following question. Given that air pollution exposure has been identified as an important risk factor for COVID-19 mortality, specifically for secondary pollution like PM 2.5, why aren't the COVID cases more homogeneous in this particular area of Southern California? Please go to the next slide. So the answer really lies in inequitable land use. So inequitable land use is actually what's leading to these higher levels of primary air toxic emissions in vulnerable communities. Specific examples of these include upzoning in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, which leads to an influx of hazardous facilities into the communities. Another example is the deliberate construction of highways in vulnerable communities, which leads to higher exposures of traffic-related pollution. And the land use changes near residential communities will degrade air quality and subsequently degrade early childhood education due to chronic illnesses. It lowers property values, and it confines vulnerable communities and limits social mobility and hinders the flexibility to migrate away from these locations. Sadly, these are artifacts of redlining after the Great Depression. Next slide. So moving forward, we need to consider the historical context of inequitable land use when we're addressing air pollution exposure disparities. First, we need to be more aware of the disproportionate generation of consumption and waste across ethnic demographics, where Black and Brown and Indigenous communities generate less pollution, but were exposed to more pollution than white communities. My time's up. We should also push for policies that penalize unsustainable development in historically underserved communities. Next slide, please. Finally, in terms of technology interventions, we need to push for zero emissions technologies that eliminate toxic air pollutions, which will actually benefit all populations. Further, I think we've seen that working from home whenever possible reduces the disproportionate impact of traffic-related pollutants on all communities. And with that, please feel free to contact me if you'd like to discuss anything I've presented today.
Thank you, Dr. Ivey, for that great presentation and highlighting the historical environmental inequities related to air pollution. Next, I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Juyong Choi. Dr. Choi is an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Florida A&M University, Florida State University, College of Engineering. He leads the Sustainable and Resilient Infrastructure Laboratory to address emerging issues facing critical infrastructure systems, which spans from aging infrastructure to climate change, sustainability, and post-disaster resiliency. Dr. Choi received an NSF National Science Foundation RAPID grant to look at COVID-19 and its impact on municipal solid waste management facilities. Please join me in welcoming our second panelist.
Yeah, thank you, Colleen, for your kind introduction. My name is Juyong Choi, and in this presentation, I would like to talk about how we can make our waste management systems resilient enough to keep the environment clean and minimize the potential spread of the infectious disease. Next slide, please. So our waste management services are a kind of a system which consists of multiple entities and their interaction. For example, next. Please, yes. Once waste is collected by either recycling trucks, waste collectors, or people from residential areas and local businesses, the collected waste will proceed to different facilities such as transfer station and landfill sites. Although different waste management systems offer similar services, but their systems are unique in terms of what entities exist in the system, how these entities interact with one another, and please click. Please next, yes. Who owns and manage these facilities? In response to these challenges, each system has adopted each system differently. For instance, as you can see from the slide, in order to accommodate a spike in the volume of residential waste, some systems stopped picking up yard waste and focused their resources on the collection of residential waste, which resulted in a change in the interaction between waste collectors and residential customers. Also, please, next, please. Due to the limited PPE for waste workers, other local government agencies and volunteer organizations become important part of the system. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at two waste management systems, one system in Florida and the other one in California, and compare them to see how they have responded differently during the pandemic. This is one of the waste management system in Florida, as you can see in this slide. The waste to energy facilities is the primary means of disposal to this system. From the waste generation source, commercial and residential waste is collected in two ways: transport by customers themselves to the collection point and the collection by the waste collectors. Next slide, please. In the beginning of the pandemic, around like April, this system faced lots of challenges and had to take a lot of adaptive measures. Next, please. In particular, there was suspension of household hazardous waste services due to the difficulty in maintaining social distances. And also, next, material recovery facilities were suspended and all of the recyclables were diverted to waste to energy facility due to the concern about recycling contamination. As a result, some of the interactions between entities were removed, as you can see in this slide. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the second system in California. There are three main sources of the waste stream: residential, commercial, and industry roll-off. Please note that unlike System 1, this system mainly relies on material recovery facility and composting facility to treat any incoming daily waste, and does not have waste energy facilities in the system, since California does not allow for having incineration facilities in the system. Next, please. Like System 1 in Florida, this system also experienced lots of challenges and took various adaptive measures in the beginning of the pandemic. But unlike System 1, there was no change in interactions between system entities. In particular, next please. In response to the concern about the recycling contamination, the system addressed this concern by allowing the recyclables to stay for a longer period before sorting, instead of diverting the recyclables to other disposal facilities. In other words, two systems have responded to even the same challenge differently. Next, please. So different systems may face their own unique challenges and responded differently. Next, please. Then how can we develop a plan for future pandemic events? Next. We believe that our RAPID project can develop an informational database where a local waste management system can find and adapt the best management practices based on their regional context and system characteristics. Next. Similarly, other extreme events such as natural disasters cause lots of challenges to local waste management systems, and we believe that such accumulated knowledge help us to respond to such disruptive events in a more sustainable and effective way. Thank you, and this is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Choi, for that great presentation. I'd next like to introduce our third speaker, Dr. Shakira Hobbs. Dr. Shakira Hobbs is an assistant professor in the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Kentucky. Dr. Hobbs' scholarship explores multidisciplinary approaches to sustainable engineering, international development, and life cycle thinking applied to the food, energy, water nexus. Her area of research focuses on developing methods to manage anthropogenic activity, such as converting waste to energy and modeling transport of pesticides. In 2018, she founded BioGals, a US nonprofit organization that works internationally empowering women of color to create sustainable solutions. I highly recommend you check it out. Dr. Hobbs received some seed funding from National Science Foundation as well for wastewater assessment for coronavirus in Kentucky, or WACI. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hobbs.
Thank you, Colleen. It's an honor to be here, and I will briefly talk about working with communities and innovating with food waste and wastewater. The world is healing. We saw environmental conditions improve and more wildlife roaming in cities. Watching this happen during COVID-19 highlighted the stark reality and the effects pollution and waste have on environment due to human activity. Today, I want to talk to you about two fascinating ways waste can be utilized to help answer COVID-19 related questions and food waste as an energy source. Next slide. Fragments of SARS-CoV-2 found in wastewater can be used to surveillance the currents of people with COVID-19. A group of researchers and I were awarded NIH seed funding to investigate coronavirus in Kentucky via wastewater. The fragments we are interested in are ribonucleic acid, RNA, inside of the virus. The RNA is a living cell, is in all living cells, and its role is to act as a messenger. Next, please. Carrying information about the virus. We can use that information to detect the presence of SARS-CoV-2 in wastewater. Next slide. We collected wastewater samples from the wastewater treatment plant. The wastewater was autoclaved and spiked with synthetic SARS-CoV-2 RNA to simulate a positive person shedding the virus. The samples were put under 3 different environmental conditions. The RNA was extracted from the wastewater using exclusion-based sample preparation and analyzed using polymerase chain reaction. Next slide. 8 different experiments were used to evaluate the aging of SARS-CoV-2 under various conditions. We're looking at these conditions because these are various environmental stressors the samples may be under during transport to the lab for analysis. Next slide. The copies of SARS-CoV-2 are still present at day 3 for most samples. However, no copies are present after a week. This assists with understanding the factors that influence the degradation and time period in which wastewater samples need to be analyzed to make an informed decision. For example, rural areas may be located far from labs for analysis and/or may be in conditions that accelerate the degradation of SARS-CoV-2 RNA. COVID-19 taught us about disparities and how we need effective solutions to help our most vulnerable communities. We've seen this technology be deployed at college dorms, nursing homes, shelters, and prisons. Additional vulnerable communities that could benefit from this are rural communities to mid-income countries with septic tanks and trench latrines. Since I've been working with, next slide, please. Since I've been working with the rural village in Belize, I became aware of how important it is to involve communities in the decision-making process. I've been working with City River Village in Belize since 2015 and the main method for managing their waste is burning, burying, and dumping trash in the river. The community wanted to explore methods for managing organic waste. Next slide. The spider graph on the right shows current waste management techniques. These are how things are currently ran, and community members want to go from larger area to smaller area. Next. The introduction of biodigesters or anaerobic digestion to manage food waste reduced the area. Anaerobic digestion is a renewable energy technology that converts organic waste like food waste to energy. Next slide. With the community, we identify anaerobic digestion as a viable method for managing food waste and utilizing biogas to cook school lunches. We had several interactions with community members, designing the prototype and testing it with the community. We spent a lot of time at the school engaging with primary school kids and introducing them to anaerobic digestion. We built a pilot scale digester with the local construction company. Lastly, women of color that join me on these trips gain a sense of belonging and identify more with being an engineer. And this is just a clip of us loading the digester. Next slide. From sessions 3 and 4, we talked a lot about resource recovery from wastewater. I briefly demonstrated ways we can amplify the value of waste, recover resources, and engage community and technology integration. Due to COVID-19, it's been challenging coordinating international research, but there have been opportunities to support knowledge exchange. Next. Finally, it's important to continue this work because of the impact it continues to have on women of color in engineering. Here are some of the colleagues who accompanied me to Belize and worked on this work with me. All are continuing in engineering as faculty members, postdoctoral scholars, recent graduate, project engineers, and environmental engineer for a government agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hobbs, for that great presentation and all your research and work with the community. And next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Costa Samaras. Dr. Samaras is an associate professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and affiliated faculty in the Energy Science, Technology, and Policy program at Carnegie Mellon University. His research spans energy, climate change, automation, and defense analysis. Dr. Samaras analyzes how energy technology and infrastructure system design affect energy use and national security, resilience to climate change impacts, economic and equity outcomes, and life cycle environmental emissions and other externalities. Dr. Samaras regularly provides commentary to online print, radio, and television media, so you may have seen his articles in the New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and other outlets. He has presented his research to senior appointed governmental leaders as well. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Samaras.
Thank you so much, Dr. Naughton, for that excellent introduction and very kind introduction. I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm going to talk about shaping the future of the U.S. transportation system under uncertainty from COVID-19. I'd like to thank the great graduate students that I work with, and specifically Abdullah Al-Arfaj, who is working on this topic with me, and Professor Mike Griffin. Next slide, please. Okay, since this is a session about pollution reduction, I'm going to start with a pollution control device from the 19th century. This is a boot scraper. And so with each horse producing about 15 to 30 pounds of manure per day, multiplied by hundreds of thousands of horses in a city, the boot scraper enabled you to remove, I don't know, 75%, 80% of this pollution from your shoes before you went into your home, right? But the transition to automobiles, albeit powered with leaded gasoline, solved this problem, but it introduced a lot of new ones. Next slide, please. Civil and environmental engineers, urban planners, and architects shaped the future. In a lot of places in the United States, this is our current legacy. Neighborhoods and livelihoods were bisected by concrete, and pollution has disproportionately and continuously affected communities of color. The next transportation system has to be different. Next slide. We have a huge challenge in decarbonizing transportation. Transportation is now the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. And within the transportation sector, emissions from cars and SUVs, that's the blue area here, is the largest source. The emissions from aviation is the red area, and the emissions from freight trucking, primarily from freight trucking, is in the yellow area here. All right, so what does this mean? Well, see, the dotted line there is an 80% reduction in transportation emissions. This means we're going to have to reduce emissions from all of these sectors below that line to get an 80% reduction in transportation emissions. But there's more. We don't need an 80% reduction. We need emissions to go to zero. We heard from Dr. Ivey that COVID-19 has reduced activity in electricity use, in transportation, in industrial output, and others. Even under the peak of COVID-19, transportation emissions were down by about 30 to 40%. A pandemic is the worst possible way to reduce emissions. And yet, even under a global lockdown, we still had only an emissions reduction of 30, 40%. So the question is now, what kind of system do we bounce back to? Auto sales are down. Some cities are investing in bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure, but there's been a shift away from public transit. These trends can affect the way that the future unfolds. Next slide, please. So what we're working on is modeling the broad range of plausible futures to understand and identify robust policy and infrastructure pathways for transportation decarbonization. All right, what does that mean? We can look at how this works for when travel changes, when technology changes, when the grid changes, when behavior changes, and really try to understand what are the targets within all of those that we need to hit to make sure that we're on track to decarbonizing transportation. One thing really stands out, how much we drive. The next transportation system needs to focus on equitable zero carbon mobility and a just transition while winding down the era of oil. Next slide, please. There are a lot of new technologies emerging in transportation, and we model the impact of a lot of these. Automation in shipping, automation in passenger vehicles, micromobility. These technologies could improve the life cycle environmental outcomes. They could improve equity outcomes, or they could make all of these a lot worse. We don't have to wait and regret the next transportation system. We have the opportunity to shape it right now. We as engineers have an ethical responsibility to design a sustainable and equitable future for everyone so that we can look back with pride on this next phase of the transportation system. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Samaras, for your wonderful presentation and the reminder of our ethical obligations as engineers in all the work and research you do. I'd like to introduce our last panelist, Dr. Julie Zimmerman. Dr. Zimmerman holds joint appointments as a professor in the Department of Chemical and Environmental Engineering and School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale University. She also serves as the Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at FES, as well as the Deputy Director of Center for Green Chemistry and Green Engineering at Yale. Her pioneering work established the fundamental framework for her field with her seminal publications on the 12 Principles of Green Engineering in 2003. Dr. Zimmerman is also the co-author of the textbook Environmental Engineering, Fundamentals, Sustainability, and Design, used throughout the world in the United States in our environmental engineering courses. In addition, Dr. Zimmerman is editor-in-chief for Environmental Science and Technology. Prior to coming to Yale University, Dr. Zimmerman was a program manager at the United States Environmental Protection Agency, where she established the National Sustainable Design Competition P3, People, Prosperity, and Planet. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Zimmerman.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. And for those of you following the P3 award, the 18th call for proposals just went out today. So hopefully you'll see that from the EPA and check it out. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the convergence with COVID in terms of the impact healthcare has on the environment, and then talk about what a green chemistry future might look like with a neat example that we just launched, a new company. So next slide, please. So the first thing to talk about is the impact of the healthcare sector globally. It's about 4.6% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. And you'll note the US is quite out of scope with other countries in terms of our emissions per healthcare treatment. Next slide, please. So interestingly enough, if healthcare were a country, it would rank 13th in the world for greenhouse gas emissions. So this presents a really a big opportunity, I would say, to bring engineering and chemistry to bear on how we provide healthcare and closes this loop on, we often think about climate change impacts on health, but this is really providing healthcare and the impacts on climate change. All of this data I'm presenting was before COVID. Okay, next slide, please. And if we dig into this data a little bit, there's lots of opportunities for engineers to get involved in terms of how we reduce the environmental impact of healthcare, whether it's thinking about buildings and architecture, how we do air exchange, airflow, travel associated with healthcare, and then looking, of course, at all the materials and chemicals. And we heard recently about PPE just a minute ago. Okay, so next slide. So just like thinking about how we reduce the environmental impact of the medical sector, we could think writ large about the chemical sector. And earlier this year, Science Magazine did an issue in their series on Tomorrow's Earth related to how do you design chemistry to match what we want for tomorrow's Earth. And so the resulting paper of that is what I'm going to present now. So next slide. So if we think about the existing chemical sector, it looks a lot like this. We've heard already about linear flows of taking resources that tend to be fossil fuels and putting them through a very linear system, generating waste both at production and post-consumer use. We could also dig in and look at the kinds of chemistry that we're doing and the kinds of chemical engineering processes, and often the reliance on environmental engineers to clean up the landfills and impacts from incineration and emissions to water and air as a result of this process. Next slide. The other thing we note, of course, is the fence line community impacts of these chemicals and the way the current chemical sector operates. And so there's an opportunity to think about tomorrow's chemical sector to not only address these broad scale environmental impacts and public health concerns, but really these local environmental injustices. Next slide, please. So the article goes into quite detailed description of what tomorrow's chemical sector could look like. Most immediately, you'll note it's moving from a linear process to one that's more circular and in a thoughtful way. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute as this push towards circular economy has emerged in our field. What does that really look like as we operationalize it? And if you dig into some of the underlying attributes of this new chemical sector, it talks about using renewable feedstocks, things that are non-toxic, using biomimicry to inform how we do chemical transformations, and changing our definition of what functional performance means to include sustainability as well. So next slide. So this is our latest company that we've launched out of the Center for Green Chemistry and Green Engineering. It's called Air Company. So this is a catalyst that we've patented and licensed to this company. The student who is leading this research is actually the CTO associated with the company, and it takes carbon dioxide, reacting it in sunlight with water over this catalyst to produce vodka, ethanol. Ethanol, as Costas talked about, of course, is one of the options in how we move towards renewable fuel. But the economics of ethanol for fuel are quite hard to overcome, but people will pay $70 or $80 for a liter of vodka. So this is where the company started. Next slide, though. So this short video will tell you as the company has evolved. So for 6 months, we have produced vodka, and actually during that time from March through July, the company is based in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, actually switched to producing hand sanitizer to address some of the shortages around New York City for healthcare workers. They're back to producing vodka. And if you remember that fence line community that I showed you, this is actually where the chemical plant is located. And so you'll see it's a green space. There's lots of people around. The community that surrounds this looks really different. And if we think about solving environmental injustices, now we're talking about local economic development. We're actually talking about, instead of people fighting NIMBY, not in my backyard, for chemical plants, to put chemical plants in my community. It creates a tax base, it creates jobs, and it's actually not harmful for public health or the environment. That video that went by was the company just received a really recent contract from NASA to take CO2 and make rocket fuel and other molecules that are relevant if we think about long-term space travel. So if we can take carbon dioxide to ethanol, we can make plastics, we can make building materials, and change this world towards something that's more carbon negative using green chemistry and green engineering. So next slide. So I'm going to just talk you through a little bit about the flow here in terms of how we think about designing a green chemistry future. So the first one is function has to be at the heart and center of what we do. If what we make doesn't do what it's supposed to do, whether it's an adhesive or a paint or a water treatment technology, we're not going to succeed no matter how sustainable it is. The next question we would ask is it made from depleting resources? So if we're relying on fossil fuels, we can't get long-term sustainability from this. We need to move to renewable feedstocks. This includes bio-based feedstocks as well as waste feedstocks, such as carbon dioxide or cellulose and lignin, chitin, other vastly wide available waste materials from industrial processing. Okay, next is to then talk about the toxicity. What is the inherent nature of the chemicals, materials we're making, as well as the transformation or processing we're using to create those products and materials? How do we move towards things that are more benign, inherently safer, so we're less concerned about controlling the circumstances in which these things are utilized? Again, this benefits a public health perspective and addresses environmental injustice. And then finally, the next thing to think about is this idea and this giant push towards the circular economy. But as you really start to dig into this and start thinking about it, there are lots of things that we make and we know as environmental engineers wind up in wastewater treatment plants that are never going to come back into a circular economy, whether it's shampoo, pesticides. These things are distributed in the environment and are intended to be so. And so we actually want to think whether these things should be made to be degradable versus those things that we want to design to be persistent because they have high molecular complexity or because they have high embedded energy. And therefore, it makes sense to try to close the loop on those materials versus things that we should not be chasing to bring into a circular economy. So next slide, and it's my last slide, is the difference between the compass and the speedometer. And I know I've laid out quite a bold vision and some big goals, but big opportunities for this community. And I would just remind all of us that the most important thing is to orient to true north and that we agree on a path of where we want to go and what the destination is, and maybe worry a little bit less about how fast we can get there. And with that, I'm happy to participate in the discussion and take any questions. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Zimmerman, for that presentation and all your great work. Really exciting about the company making vodka, but also all of your work in green chemistry and everyone, all the panelists' work in general, trying to address pollution prevention before treatment and for things like green chemistry and others. So I do invite all the panelists to turn on their videos, and all the attendees, please submit questions in the questions and answers on the bottom right of your panel if you have not already. We have some standard questions we ask each session that we'll start with, and then we'll get to the other submitted questions. I think we have everyone. Okay, so the first question is, what role does equity play in your research and teaching? And how do you incorporate equity in your research and teaching? So this conference is AEESP, Converging COVID-19 Environment, Health, and Equity. So that's equity is a big part of this conference. So that's why we asked this question. I guess we could go in order from the speakers if you want to touch on it. Dr. Ivey, would you like to talk about how you incorporate equity in your research and teaching?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. I'll start with research. So I am traditionally trained in air quality modeling, which is a very technically driven field. And so when I became a professor, I realized that I needed to actually paint an umbrella of equity over all of the research that I do. So what that means is applying the tools that I have strengths in to directly answer questions related to inequities and air pollution exposure. And so in terms of research, writing proposals, the broader impact statements pretty much write themselves as far as air pollution is concerned. And I always make sure to try to directly address inequities in my work. And with teaching, I actually teach thermodynamics, I teach chemical process analysis, I teach technology of air pollution control, and there is an opportunity to talk about environmental and sustainability issues, equity issues in each of these classes, because the end point of a lot of these industries is harmful exposures. And so the students actually, they enjoy seeing a cradle to grave approach or explanation of how various sources impact air pollution and health.
Thank you. Dr. Choi, do you have any comments on equity in research and teaching?
Yes, actually, as some of you may have already know, I'm a faculty member of two independent universities. One is Florida State University, and the other one is Florida A&M University. And actually, technically, I'm the I can also advise the both university. And actually, FAMU is one of the HBCUs. So generally, the way that I contribute to the institutional diversity and inclusion is generally I try to give more opportunity to these African American students, and also let them know about any opportunity. Because based on my experience, what is happening is that although these African American students, they really want to participate in any research activities and teaching activities. However, sometimes they may not know about this opportunity because of because of limited access to the information, and also they believe that they may not be eligible, although that is not the case. So generally, what I generally do, I generally take extra care about how I can disseminate any opportunity within my group, within my department to these underrepresented students, and also let them know, and also try to keep them in the loop for any opportunity. So that is kind of what I generally do within my department.
Thank you. Dr. Hobbs, anything to add? I know you touched on it in your presentation for the work you do in the community and making sure women of color are pursuing engineering and STEM, but.
Yes. So I'll add that engineering is, becoming better at integrating equity into the curriculum and the research. It is still possible for fundamental research to still happen and combine that with technology progression and technology integration. But in order for engineering to really solve these real world problems, it needs to work with the community, and we need to look at who has access to what, who receives a burden, who doesn't receive the burden. And that's the responsibility of an engineer to be able to do that. And so that's what I do in my lab. I approach that from a systems approach, looking at food, energy, water systems, looking at how they connect. And then I like going into the communities and soliciting feedback, understanding their willingness to adopt the technology. Is it something that's so far-fetched that it's, just not something that's reasonable for the community? And if so, it's something that engineering needs to address. And so that's what we look at a lot in my lab. In terms of teaching, I teach a course, Introduction to Humanitarian Engineering. Some of the students are actually online now. So we focus on the first half of the semester is decentering the technology, really understanding community needs. And then the last part of that class, we're actually designing within constraints. So how do you engineer within constraints? Lastly, I'm just really intentional about recruitment and retention of students of color in my lab. There's just certain advocates that are necessary to be able to retain students of color in engineering.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hobbs, and I think we can learn a lot from you and your methods. Definitely important to not design technologies in a vacuum without input from the community, so thank you. Dr. Samaras?
Thanks. Equity and justice are weaved through a lot of the research questions that we ask in our group. How does automation affect vulnerable communities? How could it improve public transit to underserved communities? How does new energy or other technologies affect communities that have historically been marginalized? And so a lot of our research questions have equity and justice threads that run through them. I'm also very intentional about building a supportive and diverse group and building a supportive and diverse community culture inside of our university. Finally, in teaching, I teach our first year engineers, and on the first day, the first thing that we talk about is the engineer's responsibility to equity and justice, and the way that civil environmental engineers, just as I mentioned in my talk, can have a big impact, positive or negative. And so these are engineers that may end up not being CEEs, may go be electrical or computer or mechanical engineers, and they really have to understand the ethical, the engineer's ethical responsibility. It's not something extra, it's in the codes of ethics. It's like, this is like, if you don't do this, it's bad. It's not, if you do it, it's good. And so I think that we as educators can easily make this a standard part of our curriculum because we have to, right? And because we should.
Yeah, thank you. And it seems also the doctors have added racial justice or inequities to the Hippocratic Oath, or some of them at least. So it's very important in ethics of all professions. Dr. Zimmerman?
Yeah, great. So I think there's a couple of points I want to make on this. One is we've done research to look at issues of environment and sustainability. And when you just bring those topics into the core curriculum, as we've heard about, you see an increased recruitment and retention of women and underrepresented minorities in engineering and science disciplines. So our very topic and making sure that we're robustly represented in engineering writ large and in science has an impact. I will say the second thing is you know, we're talking a lot about science and technology. I also think about the policy side, and there has to be something wrong in the way historically we've done risk assessment or thought about environmental regulations that have led to the environmental injustices that we see. And so as much as we're working on science and technology, I would also think that we all need to engage on the policy side about what the failures have been and what EPA over the next 50 years should be doing differently to address that fundamentally. And then I think everybody gave great examples about our groups and what we do. I will just speak from the perspective of environmental science and technology. We've made a really big effort to, one, we just stood up an early career editorial advisory board to try to bring a different generation and a different cohort of people into ES&T to make sure we're well positioned for the future of what our field will look like. And I have also and worked with the editorial team to spend a lot of time with first-time authors who are submitting to the journal, again, to try to broaden what that community is and who's participating and publishing in the journal for our field.
Great, thank you for those points. Yeah, I think there was a recent publication about publishing or what you should know, so that was very useful. For environmental science and technology, one of the top journals in our field, or the top journal. Okay, so the next question was related to the theme of convergence. And after hearing others on this panel and in general in convergence, how can we make our research more convergent? So at the risk of having awkward Zoom silence, I'll let anyone volunteer to answer that question. Anyone want to talk about convergence or anything they've realized from this presentation? We had people speak on, you know, wastewater, air, green chemistry, all different fields.
I'll save you the awkward Zoom silence. So I think you hit on it earlier, Colleen. I think the convergence is this idea of moving upstream and how we do design, whether it is transportation systems or chemicals or communities or technologies for those communities. And by bringing all of these ideas into the design phase, it does result in synergistic benefits across all the outcomes we're looking for. And so the convergence can really happen very early on at the design phase to address many of the issues that were raised.
Thank you. Any other comments, or if anyone thinks of anything that can come back to that? Yeah, Dr. Samaras.
I think one new thing that has been emerging that COVID has illuminated is the overlap between engineering and environmental engineering and public health at a broader perception from society. And I think that we as engineers could do a better job reaching out and having those communities work on our research projects and making sure that we can make a bigger contribution to that space.
Yeah, really important point. Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, I can also add, especially, so two other co-PIs from the other university and we recently received the funding from the NSF to establish extreme event reconnaissance organization with a focus on sustainable disaster debris management problem. And actually, so right now the management group, we are all engineers. However, we also tried to reach out to the interdisciplinary scholars who are interested in these debris management problems, because we look at this problem as interdisciplinary problem, and without their help, we believe that we cannot effectively address the major challenges.
Yeah, great point about engaging all the different fields, public health and others. Dr. Hobbs?
So I was just going to add what Dr. Samaras said. COVID has really helped with convergent research. The NIH grant that I'm a part of consists of a medical doctor, a mechanical engineer, and me, an environmental engineer. And it's solely based that we all had resources and instruments and knowledge that could be used to address something that's happening right now. So there are some blessings in disguise that are coming out of COVID, and we're learning a lot from this.
Yeah, great. Yeah, great point, Dr. Ivey.
Yep, I just wanted to make a suggestion as far as convergent research is concerned, is that people that work in the same media in some way, whether you work on air, whether you're working on the emissions, the transport, the exposure, or the direct air capture, and these elements, they span a lot of different disciplines, chemical engineering, environmental engineers, public health people. If you're working in the same media, I think we should encourage each other to talk to one another a lot more often, especially if any part of your research is related to that media. So that's my recommendation.
Yeah, definitely need to have more interactions. I know we're all very busy, but definitely important to reach convergence. So now I'll turn to some pre-submitted and submitted questions. Dr. Trotz, can you ask the first one?
Sure. This one is actually directed towards Julie, and it says, referencing the vodka plant in Brooklyn Navy Yard, redevelopment of that area only took place after at least a decade of gentrification. What steps would existing chemical plants and communities of color need to do in order to create these green spaces without driving out the existing population?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's important to remember that there's lots of opportunity in brownfields redevelopment, and this idea of bringing in chemical or material or processing plants that are based on green chemistry and green engineering and following that design flowchart I talked about changes where those chemical plants can go and why a community would want or not want a facility like that around. So this is really about changing the inherent nature of the kind of chemical manufacturing we do. And then I actually think if we do this well, having these kinds of plants located in brownfields creates opportunities to help revitalize neighborhoods, again, bringing in a tax base and jobs to a place where historic damage has been done by the very same sector.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Is there another question?
Oh, there are quite a few. So this is for the entire group. Have there been any efforts that you're aware of to standardize equity within courses, textbooks, and or research design, such as advocating that race or ethnicity be a central part of results in studies and not just a discussion point?
Any volunteers? I know Dr. Zimmerman's a well, Dr. Ivey.
I've heard across some schools in the UC that students are actually strongly requesting, I won't say demanding, that equity modules be entered or be a part of engineering classes. So this is a student-led movement from what I've seen.
Yeah, and then I think what Colleen was alluding to is in this textbook that Jim Mihelsick and I wrote along with lots of other co-authors on fundamentals of environmental engineering. There is throughout the book woven a theme of equity. We present the very early data showing toxic release inventory overlaid with socioeconomic status, and you can visually very quickly see. And so asking students to think about where landfills are located, where incinerators are located, and there's homework exercises and example problems throughout the book that kind of reinforce that theme. I don't know if that's a standard, but if it gets to have that in the curriculum, in the textbook that's being used to teach all the traditional and conventional fundamentals of environmental engineering.
Yeah, any other panelists, have you seen more standardization of equity? I know after this summer, it seems there's been a larger push, and there's still a long way to go. And as Dr. Ivey said, yeah, students are demanding it as well. So hopefully we'll see more standardization. Dr. Samaras?
I know we at Carnegie Mellon are making efforts to standardize it within our own curriculum, that many faculty had been doing it and already have been doing it for a long time. I think it would be nice if it came from AESP or ABET. And until we get to that point, I think we can have a bottom-up driven process where we're sharing best practices and incorporating this as a standard part of our curriculum.
Thank you. And yeah, seeing a lot more studies focusing on equity, but it seems more the surface, this is inequitable, but getting more to the root causes and how we address them and how we design research for equity will be important. Dr. Trotz, another question?
Sure. This is Hope Hoffman, and she says she's concerned about the waste generated by single-use PPE, the masks and face shields, which contain plastics, especially as their use is normalized. So what can be done to get ahead of this before this debris makes its way to rivers and oceans?
So actually, we also heard a lot about this concern from the multiple waste management sectors. Actually, this generally, I can see that two general approaches to address this kind of plastic contamination issue. I think I mentioned these two approaches during my presentation. Generally, in the case where they have the incineration facilities, I know it's not very, it doesn't sound like very environmental friendly. However, because of these waste contamination issues, they generally send most of these plastics to the incineration facilities. And then second, that we can see from California, they generally just let them just stay for a longer period of time. Generally, they just have them stay for at least 3 days before they start sorting this recyclable from the mix of the other waste. Because as you may know, recycling facilities, in most of the material recovery facilities, they still rely on the people in sorting and segregating and separating the recyclables. Actually, we didn't hear much about any possibility of this plastic waste going to the rivers or any water stream, because we generally talk about any issues in treating and processing and disposing of the daily municipal solid waste.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Juyong. Sorry, Colleen.
No, it's okay. I don't know, because Dr. Zimmerman touched on how healthcare is the 13th in the world in greenhouse gas emissions, if she had any comments about the PPE waste.
Sure. I mean, I think this is, as PPE waste or any other plastics we talk about, it's the nature of these materials, and we get into this conversation of plastics are bad, but it's bad plastics are bad, and there's some polymers that we somehow define as being okay, and they're natural polymers. And again, this is really changing the nature of the kinds of chemicals we use, thinking about obedient materials. How do you have a material that is stable when you want it to be and then is triggered by something it would see either in a formal waste management system or an informal waste management, and then degrade and not degrade into something like microplastics, but truly mineralize into CO2. So I think there's lots of fundamental research opportunities in this space.
Yeah, great point. And I should also not mention all plastics are bad. There are some natural polymers, of course. Great point. Yeah, Dr. Trotz, other questions?
Well, I'm not sure if this panelist can answer it, but there was a question on a follow-up on the microplastics, and it was whether there was concern of possible health impacts from people breathing in microplastics from wearing single-use plastic masks day in and day out.
Does anyone have any thoughts? I don't know, Dr. Ivey, with air pollution, but it's not completely related.
We might shoot that one back to panel 2 or 3, session 2 or 3. So there was a question that was answered on the Q&A, but I think there needs to be some clarification, so I'll ask it out loud. It was, how do you access the wastewater of positive people? And that's from someone named Tina White. So Shakira, Dr. Hobbs, can you respond?
Yes, so I guess there's several ways you can access it. So what we're doing in our study, we're getting it from the wastewater treatment plant, the local wastewater treatment plant. And so these are from residential areas, hospitals, prisons, industrial plants that are nearby. So anywhere that's in this local range. Now, there are researchers that are getting wastewater directly from buildings, or you may be hearing a lot that dorms are having their wastewater surveillance. So you can tap into building facilities, can access the wastewater from that building and be able to test it and see if there is an outbreak or potential testing or more testing that needs to be done for COVID. So I think this question is more so related to the privacy issue. So we're not so much looking at like who is positive, it's just so looking for the presence of the SARS-CoV-2 RNA so that we can be able to manage it better.
Thank you.
Thanks. Dr. Ivey, you were going to say something earlier. Just want to make sure about the microplastics, or we're good. Okay, so Dr. Trotz, to the next question.
Sure, and this is coming from AESP's president, Dr. Joel Ducoste. He asked, how do we encourage our colleagues in other disciplines to be more thoughtful about green chemistry and also about educating future engineers, which goes back to, I think, some of the equity questions.
I guess that's for me. So I mean, I think there's this opportunity again to, build this into textbooks. There's opportunity to change some of the questions around calls for proposals and the things we're asked to respond to. So broader impacts could be more specified about pushing people towards the direction of sustainability and sustainable design. I'm a good academic, so I will always say, the funding agency is putting in incentives for interdisciplinary collaboration, drives professors and researchers to behave in a certain way. And so there's opportunities to do that kind of work there. And then this is, to me, is a much broader question about, standards we use for tenure and promotion, and how we evaluate interdisciplinary work and asking people to work at these interfaces in terms of getting credit in their home discipline versus recognizing the benefits that some people might be more reductionist in their research versus people who are more broad and thinking in systems.
Thank you. Dr. Hobbs, you said you worked with mechanical engineers or other fields. Do you have any comments on colleagues in other disciplines to be more thoughtful in green chemistry and sustainability?
Well, yeah, in terms of sustainability. So, in March or April, there was a shortage of PPE. And some colleagues of mine that work in the biomedical field, they were having difficulties getting pipette tips, right? And so working in the field of biology or biomedical, you typically don't reuse pipette tips because maybe you're working with something that needs to be sterile, right? So this calls into question, do we need to discover more ways where we can recycle and reuse pipette tips, even for people who work in those fields, right? So there are some interesting things that are coming from this.
Thank you. Dr. Trotz, another question?
Yes. We have Jean McRae, who's been sending questions every week. So this is great. Thank you for that. She says, thanks to all the panelists for the great work. As the urgency of acting to limit climate change increases, do you have any thoughts on how to create buy-in for large-scale change, again, beyond our field? We seem a bit stuck between people digging in their heels and others pushing for rapid change.
Yeah, Dr. Samaras.
I think that there's a cliche and a punting when this question comes up, which is like, well, we have all the technology that we want. All we need is political will. Okay, well, the political will doesn't just appear out of thin air. It needs to be built as a coalition. It needs to be built with the voices of folks who have been outside of coalitions for a long time and who have been marginalized. And so I do think that, again, we as engineers can't afford to only look at the tech. We have to think about how the tech affects society and how that might encourage a durable coalition for change. And so what does that mean? It means that when we're proposing or designing tech in our profession, to understand how it would affect different communities, but also how it might benefit different communities, and what might be a large-scale program for change. One just baseline idea here, while we're throwing out policy ideas, is to mitigate the lead and asbestos from water lines, from public schools, from buildings, and also reinvest in our public school system, so that every community would be able to feel the benefits immediately, rather than concentrating them in some large cities. And so we have to think about ways that we build that political will as engineers, not just say, well, that's somebody else's problem.
A great point. I don't know if other panelists have comments. I know Dr. Zimmerman, your last slide had the compass and then the speedometer.
Yeah, I think this is exactly what Costa was saying. So I think, it's, and I don't want to get political, but it really is marrying climate change with other societal benefits. So how does this intersect with jobs? How does this intersect with issues of equity? How do we solve other societal problems that also solve our challenges around climate change? So I think that helps to build the political will if you can pivot the conversation around process and how we get there, and instead talk about what is the ends that we're trying to realize, and what are different pathways to getting there. And many of those will wind up also being beneficial for climate change. So I think we need to change the conversation to build that kind of political will. And again, I'm a little bit biased, but I do think starting to think about how CO2 has economic value as an industrial feedstock also changes the market mechanisms around capturing CO2 and using it for fuels, for chemicals, for building materials, for plastics.
Great. Dr. Trotz.
There's a follow-up on that. I was wondering if the panelists could give some more concrete steps of things that could be taken at the societal and governmental level to sort of reach the net zero emissions or to address the equity issues. So what are some things that either AESP can do or that we could do as individual faculty, or programs that have been successful to train our engineers to do more of this stuff?
Dr. Ivey? Not so.
If I heard correctly, I heard what are the concrete steps we could take? Was it at the government level or at the faculty level?
Well, they didn't ask for concrete steps. They asked if you have any insight on the steps that could be taken. And so I was just wondering if we could give some examples of things that we are already doing that should be amplified.
I'm gonna pivot a little bit. This may be an issue of how different energy sectors are subsidized at the federal level. If we start investing more in the greener and low carbon intensity or zero carbon technologies, investing in those and perhaps pulling resources away from energy production that takes us away from our climate goals, I think that's probably the most dead-on way to address our climate issues. And the most that we can do is continue to produce our papers that support this and provide the data that support this. But if the people that fund these operations don't listen to us, I'm not really sure what we as individuals can do to stop these large systems that are perturbing the climate.
So
yeah, Doc.
yes, actually, one of the interesting things that we found is actually one of the participating waste systems is we have one small like town from New York, and then actually their town is one of the EPA's zero waste cities. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about this initiative. And actually for them, recycling is mandatory. One thing that we found very interesting is generally one of the biggest concerns we found across the most of the waste management sectors is reduction in the revenue because of the decrease in the commercial waste. And also generally, from the recycling perspective, cardboard and plastic, they are the most valuable material for recycling. However, they are so worried about the waste contamination of the workers because generally, at the time when waste comes to the facility, they are in a mix with others. So they have to touch the material and then segregate them. However, in the case of these zero waste city, the name of the town is the New Pelt. They are already, at the time when they receive the material, they are already well segregated from the other material. So there's a less concern about the waste contamination. And also at the same time, they are able to, recycle the highest number of the material compared to the non-pandemic situation. So I think it looks like maybe doing more recyclable, I think sustainable waste management system may be more resilient to the pandemic. So that is, we are getting to the conclusion right now.
Yeah. Great point that these systems can be more resilient to natural and human-made disasters. Dr. Hobbs, you had your hand raised.
Yes, so in the theme of convergent research, this is a great opportunity to partner with behavior scientists. Let's understand what are some of the reasons why people are not doing this or why they are doing it. We're looking at buy-in, we're looking at human behavior, we're looking at what people are comfortable with. So let's team up with behavior scientists to try to understand, do people respond more to incentives or do they respond more to penalties where they have to pay a fee for doing a certain behavior? But I think that would be a way or a start to start addressing some of these issues or resistance or uncertainty about climate change.
Thank you. Dr. Zimmerman?
Yeah, I totally agree. So I think for a long time for environment, we have largely played half a policy strategy, which has been the regulatory side, and we are not as good on the incentives and innovation, encouraging innovation side. And there's huge policy opportunities there, whether it's research and development tax credits, it's patent life extension, this idea of driving things towards continuous improvement. There's lots of work on, again, a little bit outside of the engineering realm, but thinking about accounting standards, being listed on stock exchanges and having to show a commitment to equity or sustainability as a company in order to play in some of the financial markets. So there's lots of policy levers out there that have not been exploited yet at that scale, let alone at the individual scale, as Dr. Hobbs was referring to.
Yeah, all great points. Dr. Samaras, you had your thumbs up, or did you have anything you wanted to mention?
I was just giving an emoji in real life.
Thank you. And of course, on time, the municipal solid waste is coming. So sorry for any background noise. Yeah, Dr. Samaras, I know you do a lot of writing and like media and like news articles. Is there any comments about making this kind of a societal and government change through that, or things you've learned?
I think that engineers and scientists, folks in this community, have a lot of knowledge that shouldn't just sit on shelves. And we have a responsibility to do great science and do great engineering, get it peer reviewed, get it published, and then take these conclusions and distill them and communicate them to the public. And it doesn't have to be an either or, right? It's something that we can try to do all of this. It needs to be recognized by our academic communities, which I think it's becoming more and more. But even individually as researchers, the community wants to hear from you, right? They believe in the work that you're doing, and you have a lot of institutional knowledge, and you could pair that with local knowledge to make some real change in your community. So don't be afraid to push your work beyond our academic networks.
Great, thank you. We probably should close soon. Is there one last question, Dr. Trotz?
There was one last one on PFAS, and so it was, as we move away from fluoride-based chemicals, how can we ensure that the replacements aren't worse? After all, it took decades to show the detrimental health effects of PFAS.
Dr. Zimmerman?
Yeah, I mean, I think PFAS, phthalates, bisphenol A. So you can talk about all these chemicals that went through the EPA and international chemicals management policy programs and emerged as viable for use. And then we wait, right, for a public health impact before we turn around and regulate. And so we need to change that model. And this gets back to the underlying approach to risk assessment of who can be harmed and how much. And that's how much we allowed out in the environment from a societal harm perspective. And so lots of new tools are coming out that our community has a great role to play around understanding how chemicals and molecules fundamentally interact with biological systems or natural systems. What is it about that molecule in terms of its physical chemical properties? And then how do you design those chemicals so they have the function you want without those hazards? And so this gets back to all the work that we normally do as environmental engineers to figure out fate and transport and of a molecule based on its chemical properties. And so using that now to inform safer design from a toxicity perspective.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, I know we're getting to time, so I'd like to conclude now. So thank you to all our amazing panelists for their insightful presentations and answering questions. We appreciate all of our attendees on Zoom or YouTube today or later asynchronously. Thank you to our sign language interpreters and closed captioners to help make our session more accessible. Also a huge thanks to those on the organizing committee behind the scenes. And thank you to my grandmother. Without her inspiration and emphasis on education, I would not be here moderating this session for you all today. So as we close today, I invite you to maybe close your eyes and envision the future without pollution or waste. Imagine a world without landfills or litter or food waste, where all products and items are designed for disassembly and a sustainable end of life. A future where we utilize green chemistry instead of toxic and hazardous chemicals. Imagine a world where many less people die and suffer from cancer, toxicity, and air pollution. Imagine a world where the environment is clean, And we are not finding plastics and toxins in the bellies of birds and fish and other animals. In the context of COVID-19, the necessity of a future without pollution or waste is ever more apparent, particularly for Black, Hispanic, Indigenous, and other underserved communities that are disproportionately impacted by waste and pollution and COVID-19. That future is possible given the talks we heard today and commitment from environmental engineers and scientists and everyday citizens like all of you listening. I challenge you to commit even more after the session to make that future a reality. Thank you for the opportunity to be your moderator today, and I now invite Dr. Trotz to close the session.
Thank you, Colleen, and thank you to everyone for an amazing session. We'd like to remind everyone that they can go on the AESP convergingcovid19.org or take a picture of this QR code to get to the quiz that addresses the question with questions from this session. And you do get credit. You get credit for Envision credentials, and you also get a certificate from AESP Converging COVID-19. We have our last session that comes next week, and we're looking at climate change mitigation and adaptation. So do tune in again at 12 p.m. next Friday. I'd like to again thank our sponsors, the National Science Foundation, AESP, and of course the University of California, Merced, and University of South Florida, and to the staff and students who are behind the scenes working on this conference. Thank you, everyone, and have a safe weekend. And from all of us, Colleen, Dr. Naughton, very sincere condolences on the passing of your grandmother.